Hi, it's Maya here with my late November wrap-up. In November I read 5 books and 4 comics, and I'm going to talk about the books first, and I will go in order from the one that I like the least to the one that I like the most. The first thing that I read in November was the Finnish edition of The Sun King by Nancy Mitford, which I found at my library's book swap shelf. And this is a non-fiction book that claims to be more about Versailles than it actually is. The whole title is The Sun King Louis XIV at Versailles. So the subject matter sounded interesting, but the focus wasn't as much on Versailles as I would have liked. Also, it was unchronological at times, which I don't really enjoy. I did learn some interesting tidbits, like about legislature or medical practices, but not enough about Versailles. I guess since I read this in November, I sort of took part in non-fiction November. Anyway, I gave this one only 2 stars. Then I finished Octavia Butler's Patternmaster or Seed to Harvest series by reading Patternmaster, which is the last book in the series in inner chronological order, but it was actually written first, and I've been slowly reading these books from this digital omnibus that I have. This one is set in the far future, where the telepathic Patternists and the alien mutated Clayarchs fight over Earth, and regular humans are this minority that serve the Patternists in their houses. We follow Terray, a young Patternist who is just leaving school and wanting to become an apprentice before starting his own house, but he finds himself being forced into the house and under the power of a strong Patternist. So I'll talk about my general thoughts about this whole series now that I've finished it. My favorites were the 2nd and the 4th book, Mind of My Mind and Patternmaster, which were the earliest that she wrote in publication order. I think I prefer her earlier works because they are easier flowing and faster to read and more character based. The focus of the whole series is on power structures and the abuse of power and other hard topics like that, but the ones that were written later were much grimmer. So Wild Seed, which is the first in the inner chronological order, but a later book in her career, it's clearly better written, but my reading experience of it was harder and more uncomfortable because of one of the main characters who was quite unpleasant. He was meant to be, but still. Patternmaster was more of an adventure story, even though the mood of it was also quite oppressive. I gave this one 3.5 stars. So next I'm going to talk about The Firestone by Tanya Huff, which is a high fantasy book from 1990. The plot seems very basic. It's a trio of a prince, a thief and a wizard who have to go and find the stolen Firestone, which is this magical artifact that keeps the kingdom from being basically buried by a volcanic eruption. But the focus on this is on characters, which make it stand out and feel a lot more unique. So in this one there's 3 main characters, and we really delve into them as characters and their weaknesses, and especially their relationships with their ruler fathers. The Prince Darvish wants his judging father's acceptance, but since he is the younger son of the king, people don't want him to mix in politics, so he doesn't really have a lot to do and he feels useless, so he drowns himself in parties and affairs and alcohol. The thief Aaron is haunted by the memory of his cold and abusive father who also killed his early love. He's also dealing with the remnants of homophobia of his birth country. In Darvish's country, where this is set, bisexuality seems to be the norm, so Aaron really has to struggle with some of his awakening feelings. There's also the wizard, who is Princess Chandra, who doesn't recognize her father, who has distanced himself from everyone after her mother's death. Also, she's pressured into getting married, because otherwise she can't inherit the throne, and she would just want to focus on her magic studies and ruling her kingdom and not worry about marriage stuff. About the first 20% of this book was focused on Aaron and his relationship with this old woman, and Darvish and his feelings of uselessness and partying and how these two meet. So when Chandra was introduced, it was later on, and I felt a bit of a disconnect with her because of that. There is a lot to love about this book. One thing that I really enjoyed was the relationship between the main trio. I also liked how Aaron seems to be the only white character in this. This is set in Darvish's country. And the fact that the country itself seems to be one where bisexuality is the norm. Also, Tanya Huff is really great with minor background characters and putting women as secondary characters, because often it seems like there are some worlds where only the main character happens to be a woman and all the background characters are men. Not so in this one. Be it a priest or a soldier or a wizard, there's like a 50-50% chance that this background character is a woman. So that's all great and refreshing, but there's one really big minus to this book, and that is the attitudes toward fat people, which are very, very bad. from how the fat characters are described to what personalities they have. There's definitely a content warning in this for fat shaming and fat phobia. Otherwise, this was a really fun and quick adventure with great character relationships, and I gave this one 4 stars. I feel sort of torn about that rating, but I really enjoyed the main trio and their strong relationship between each other, but the fat phobia is really bad. Next I'm going to talk about a modern classic, and that is Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson. I received this as a Secret Santa gift in 2016 from Elizabeth from Books and Pieces. And this is about the spinster governess Miss Pettigrew, who gets accidentally hired as a maid for Delucia LaFosse, who is a nightclub singer and actress, and an unforgettable day ensues. I had seen the movie adaptation of this a few years ago, but I had forgotten a lot of the twists and turns, and I have re-watched the movie after reading this book, and they have changed quite a lot. But I love the character of Miss Pettigrew. She is a delight to follow. She is this great character, a spinster governess, who decides just for one day to just go for it. And she's thrown from one tricky situation and wild party to the next and manages to be an absolute boss. Having said that, Miss Pettigrew and the Firestones share some similar issues. They are both feel-good, a bit older books, even though not equally old, and I love the characters, but there are some outdated attitudes. I hated the Mr. Right, the supposedly good love interest of the Lucius, mainly because of those outdated attitudes, namely racism and sexism. The chapter 10, the one where he's introduced, is basically a trash fire. I still ended up giving this 4 stars as well. Miss Pettigrew is a great character. You can read this in one day and whisk just through it, but it would be a lot better if that one chapter just didn't exist. And finally, my favorite read of the month was Jackalope, Wives and Other Stories by Ursula Vernon, writing under the name T. Kingfisher. This is a short story collection of mainly fairy tale inspired short stories, but also some other short stories and also poems. And like all short story collections, there are some stories that I liked more and some that I liked less, but there wasn't a dot in here. I really love Vernon and her writing style. It's a very matter of fact, no nonsense sort of folklorist style, which I really enjoy. And what stories you prefer from this just really comes down to taste. My personal favorites are the 2 Grandma Harken stories, Jackalope Wives and The Tomato Thief, which I have both read before but gladly read again. Grandma Harken is this great older woman character who lives at the edge of the desert and gets things done, be they magical or non-magical. I also really enjoyed the poem Editing, the short story The Dryad's Shoe, which is a retelling of Cinderella, and I found myself liking both Razorback and Pocosin a lot more than I had when I had first read them online. Perhaps I just hadn't been on the right mood to read them at the time. The ones that weren't for me were Wooden Feathers, because I just don't get along with Pinocchio tales. Also, That Time with Bob and the Unicorn, which just wasn't my sort of story. I gave this one 5 stars, just the 2 Grandma Harken stories are so good. Now I'm going to quickly go through the comics that I read in November, also in order of preference. First is Lucky Penny by Ananth Hirsch and Yuko Ota, which is about Penny who loses her apartment and her job on the same day, and she ends up living in the storage compartment of her friends and working in a laundromat under a young boy. And she also meets someone and falls in love. It's about this 20-something life. The artwork was really nice and clean and I really enjoyed it, but the plot of a 20-something learning about herself and adulting it wasn't really a hit with me. And there are also some absurdist and fantastical elements at the end, a little reminiscent of Scott Pilgrim. But since they weren't introduced in the beginning, they just sort of felt superfluous and a weird fit to the rest of the book. I gave this one 2.5 stars. I continued reading the Harrow County horror comic series with Volume 4 and Volume 5. Volume 4 is Family Tree and Volume 5 is The Abandoned by Cullen Bunn and Tyler Crook. And this continues the story of Emmy, who is a reincarnation of a powerful witch. But these volumes, more players are introduced and the plot gets a lot bigger. And we get some interesting backstory, and in Volume 5 we get a really big revelation. This is not my top favorite current series, but I do enjoy reading it every time. I love the fact that at the end of the volumes there is always the pencils and the thumbnail sketches for the cover arts. The covers are really beautiful, and I love the design of all the creatures and monsters, especially the huge bull-like Abandoned. I gave Volume 4 3 stars and Volume 5 3.5 stars. And my favorite comic that I read in November was Monstress Vol.2 by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda, and this is a high fantasy comic about 17-year-old Maika half-wolf who has a link with this powerful monster, and this is set in an Art Deco inspired steampunk world, and there's a ton of cool women characters. I felt much more connected to the main character in this volume. In the first volume she had felt a bit distant, and I also really enjoy the interplay between her and the monster. Also, the world is more familiar, of course, because it's the second volume, and more of the world and more of the players are introduced, and the art continues to be absolutely stunning. It's hard to choose my favorite, most visually interesting character from this volume. The sirens look great, there was this one cool ship captain, there was a shark woman, there was the leader of Thuria, and also the pun of necromancer always makes me laugh. It's such a clever wordplay. I did give the first volume 4 stars, but the art did bump up that rating a bit. But in this volume, the story itself was spot on as well, so I gave this one a very strong 4 stars. So that was all that I read in November. Let me know if you have read any of these books, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!